Welcome to 20 Minutes with 2020 Mendocino. My name is Carlos. I'll be your host on this journey. Today, we will be discussing Trainwreck, our TDub, our Arcata Rec, and our other sativa projects. This conversation dragged out a little bit, so I'm breaking the episode up into two. The Durban portion of the episode will be released next Sunday at noon Pacific Standard Time on YouTube as always. I'd also want to give everybody a reminder that Maid of Honor Femmes and Hot Mess Femmes, along with a Trainwreck variety pack, will be released on Father's Day, June 21st. And for anybody interested in our Seed Cracker and STS or any of our other merchandise, there is free shipping until June 16th. That way you can have your gift in time for your pops on Father's Day. So just check out our merch tab on our website. It takes you directly to our Etsy page. Without further ado, let's begin the episode. On this episode of 20 Minutes with 2020 Mendocino, we'll be discussing our sativa line, particularly Trainwreck, the differences between both Trainwrecks that we've offered. We'll go a little bit into our Durban line and talk about some of our other stuff like our glue sniffer and other hybrids that we've experimented with using our in-house sativas. So, quick question, Adam. As far as you know, when did sativas become a thing of the past here on the West Coast, specifically Northern California?
Well, that's an interesting question. So, at some point back in the '90s, the gas strains started taking off, and they really a lot of the big sativas at the time were struggled to kind of maintain a foothold. So there's people that have this history down a lot more than me. I mainly experienced it from a supply and demand side, watching the market. But certainly there was a fall off of the fruity strains sometime in the late '90s, I would guess, and early 2000s.
Right on. And I just want to give a brief disclaimer that anything said that may denounce sativas on this episode is not of my taking, because I am a haze head for life. So I know that I'm trying to convert Adam and the team here to work with some hazes, but we're still working on that, y'all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so totally. We are testing hazes
So
constantly.
can you give me a brief history on your experience with Trainwreck and how that led to the creation of the TDub?
Certainly. So I talk about this a lot in previous podcasts with other interviews and some write-ups I've done. But Trainwreck is basically runs through our blood. It's a part of the foundation of our business. We go back to the mid '90s, the heyday of Trainwreck. When I first started growing in 1995, this was the first plant that I ever grew was a Trainwreck plant. And so I think I always have an affinity towards it. And interestingly, I still consider it one of the best sativas for sure, and even one of the best overall strains that in our collection. Um, so it definitely the history runs deep with 2020, and it certainly does with the Emerald Triangle as well. So in '95, I think Trainwreck had been around, actually, from what I understand, from possibly as early as the '70s. Now, it's one of those strains that has this mystique behind it, in that there's countless stories about the history of Trainwreck, and I don't even know if anyone really knows the true lineage. I would certainly not be someone to try to claim that I do, because as far as I know, no, there is no like factual information behind that. It was we used to have lore about even how it got its name, and that supposedly somebody bred it in a train car that had crashed off the tracks, and the guy drug it up to his property and grew indoors and got it going bred it in this train car. And I mean, there was all sorts of lore, and everybody will tell you a different story about where the train wreck came from. But it's really neat to talk to people from that era and even into the 2000s about uh, how they kind of all have a train wreck story. So it's kind of cool. And I've, pulled nugs out for people that hadn't seen it in years, and they smell it. And the first thing they say is, "Oh my God, it brings me back to, this particular place or time in my life." And so it's kind of a neat strain like that. And part of it is that it's such a peculiar smell and so unique in that there's not really like many other strains out there that kind of mimic that terpene profile. Although I do kind of consider a few strains that have that same family of terpenes of for sure. And I've mentioned this in other podcasts, but when it kind of irks me when people say, "Oh, that's the Jack smell," the Jack Harris smell, because I always laugh and say, "No, that's the Jack Harris. That's the train wreck smell that the Jack Harris took from the train wreck." And it certainly, I don't think Jack Harris came from train wreck, but they have, there is a cut of Jack that smells similar, or a phenotype that smells similar, but they're not the same when you compare them next to each other. And same with Durban, which we'll talk about the Durban here towards the end of this podcast. But uh, Trainwreck in general is an absolute wonderful strain to grow. It's a top heavy strain, so it needs to be well secured, trellised. It's very mold resistant. It has these kind of perfect form for mold resistance, and that it has lots and lots and lots of nugs, and none of them are super huge, and it doesn't have this like real thick leaf structure. It's kind of a pre-trimmed strain when it's grown right. And it it finishes pretty early for outdoors. So it was one of these strains where you can almost always do good with it, even when you do bad for outdoor growing. And so back when we didn't know what we were doing, and we were rookies, and it was really an ideal strain to start with. And being later, we found out that many of the other strains that we grew next to it just didn't compete as far as yield and mold resistance. We'd have situations where we would just lose an entire plant to mold, and then the train wreck would be sitting there right next to it, all finished and ready to harvest, and basically no mold on it at all. So that's one of the biggest characteristics, one of the best characteristics that it carries to this day. And so I don't know if you want me to just move right on from this to how kind of Trainwreck has been intertwined into our history, and then the TDub, which is our version of Trainwreck, we call it. And if you have anything you want to throw in here, Carlos, go ahead. Otherwise, I'll move into this.
Well, I kind of I'm curious as well, because this is a history lesson for me too, especially being from the East Coast where I didn't experience train wreck till way later. But why was train wreck around and then not around anymore? What happened to it?
I'm glad you brought that up. So yeah, I know I can pretty much answer that question perfectly. So what happened was in around the turn of the century, around the year 2000, is when the great proliferation of cannabis growing started happening in California, and particularly the Emerald Triangle. And the green rush essentially started around then. People started flocking up. Land was still really cheap, and uh, growing kind of exponentially started growing at that point. Law enforcement had backed off. Prop 215 was really the catalyst for all this. Of course, was our medical proposition that you could basically have, 25 to 99 plants, and that's when people really started just taking advantage of that with multiple prescriptions on one property and whatnot. So, anyways, the moral of the story is that Trainwreck itself got way overgrown, to the point where at least probably half the farms in the county were growing it, and it was spread throughout the entire country. And honestly, I think people just got tired of it. It grew so well, and it was such an easy producing, yielding strain, and again, mold resistant and all these characteristics that just made it great for beginner growers, especially, to grow. that it really just got overproduced, and people were searching up for other things by the 90s, or I mean by the early 2000s. Other strains started poking up, and it's kind of funny because the same thing happened to multiple strains over time. So it wasn't just Trainwreck, and it moved right into some other strains. I mean, for instance, I remember the strain called Salmon Creek Big Bud, and it had a short-lived run. But there was a time when I think the dang near the entire county of Humboldt and pretty much most of the Emerald Triangle was growing Salmon Creek Big Bud, and it was similar to Trainwreck in that it was a huge yielding butt strain. You know, it had Amsterdam roots, and I don't actually know. It was some cross that somebody had made in probably the Salmon Creek area, which is central Humboldt County, and that strain, I mean, it had a 2 or 3 year run, and by the time, you know, after the third year, everyone was like, I don't want that weed anymore. You know, it was the entire country was basically smoking it. So and then they moved into green crack, kind of similar thing happened with that, and of course Blue Dream. That was kind of the last of the really big, like, overgrown strains that I can recall. Since then, there's been some heavy production strains, but I think diversity got took the best of the industry for a good thing, and now it's been much harder to kind of overproduce one strain, and also much more regions of the country started becoming commercial cannabis hotspots, and therefore they had their own strains going. So the diversity has always been uh, much larger since those kind of early 2000, mid 2000 years, when it was kind of bouncing from one strain to the next. So I'm glad you brought that up, though. That's a good point.
Yeah, you actually took the words out of my mouth. I was going to ask you if it went the way of Blue Dream and Green Crack, which I actually smoked some some green crack rosin the other day, and before they even told me what it was, I was like, man, that reminds me of high school. It definitely took me back. So, with that being said, can you describe what the TDub is, how it was created, and and its history?
Certainly, I will do my best. So that's a tough question to totally answer, but I'll do my best. So again, as I said, our roots with Trainwreck go way back to the mid '90s, and it was actually, not only was it the first strain I ever grew, it was also the first strain I ever bred with, and that was in about '96 or '97. I got a hold of some really good Afghan seeds, and it was just kind of this classic purple Afghan that wasn't the super perped out strain, but it was just classic Humboldt Afghan strain that we actually still have some cuts of a similar strain, and this was just a real short, squatty, heavy indica, and we ended up crossing the Trainwreck with the Afghan, and we made a strain that we called Afrec. You know, of course, easy name to come up with there, and it was actually a fabulous strain. Ended up basically being a perfect hybrid of the two. It was much bigger yielder than the Trainwreck. It kind of carried some of those low mold resistant properties, but early season, huge nugs, super flavorful, tasty, potent, everything. It kind of covered all the bases. It actually became a pretty big strain in California. Now, I don't know if the same Afrec that we bred back in '96, '97 ended up being the same one that was throughout California quite around that same time, or if somebody else had just done the same thing as us. To this day, I'll never know, but it actually was a pretty big strain down in the Sacramento and Bay Area back in around those same years. So we've kind of, what's happened with Trainwreck and us is it's kind of resurfaced in our breeding program since then. And so we'll have these seeds that basically came from some of that original stock, and then they get literally buried and resurfaced over the years, and then we kind of breed them, do some selective breeding with them for some outdoor. But the demand for Trainwreck dropped, as I had said earlier, back in the 2001, 2002, and so it kind of literally just sunk to the bottom of our vault. And after, I think it was probably at least a decade later, sometime around 2010, we ended up getting a hold of some clones from a buddy of some original Arcata Trainwreck, and we hadn't seen it in quite a few years, and we were really excited. Unfortunately, they came with tons of russet mites and probably pathogens and bugs, and who knows, like clones had been kept around for maybe 2 decades at this point. And we still ended up breeding with it, and we never really could kind of rejuvenate the strain. It was so messed up, but we bred with it, so we got the seeds from it, and we took some of our TDub seeds we had, and we crossed them with this original Arcata Trainwreck, and then kind of the same thing happened. We ran it for a few years. We did some selective breeding with it outdoors. We were kind of constantly trying to bring it back to that like perfect Trainwreck, but also hunting the more more trichomes, and maybe a little better, like sturdier plant, bigger yielder, just kind of trying to cover the bases, but still keeping the roots as that perfect Trainwreck terpene profile. And then it got basically the same thing happened around. Then it got buried again, and it finally resurfaced last year when we got some really nice clean cuts of Arcata Trainwreck from our buddies at Humboldt Sacred Roots, which is a nursery up in Arcata. And that really that's when we said, you know what, we got to bring the rec back. I mean, this is a strain, like it's nothing to be looked down upon. I mean, this is a true sativa in the way it grows. It's a true sativa in the sense that the euphoric high from it is unbeatable. I mean, it's like a cup of coffee. It doesn't put you on the couch. It motivates you. It awakens you. It brings out your senses, and it's always kind of been what I loved about Trainwreck in the end. And so uh, this last resurgence here, which was just over a year ago at this point, maybe 2 years ago, we did this again. So it was like the third time. Then we basically re crossed our seed stock with the Arcata Trainwreck, and that's when we basically kind of came out with our two Trainwreck lines. One is that basically is the Arcata Trainwreck, and the other is the TDub, which is a very complicated history that we really honestly just don't exactly remember. But it's essentially the original rec that's been selectively bred for almost 20 years. So that being said, the difference between the two, I mean, it's pretty minuscule, but we grow them side by side. We're actually growing some right now side by side, the exact seeds that we have on the market. And this is one reason why is to kind of really like pinpoint the differences, because they're really that similar. But in the end, the T-dubs, a little more frosty. It's a little bigger yielder. It's a larger um, uh, it's a larger version of the of the Arcata Rec. And it's as far as stability goes, they're both really stable. So the seeds that we grow tend to be almost identical. Um, so and part of the reason for that is that, I mean, they're super close related, but the TDub itself is an S1, so we had made it in only regular form up until this last production, where we finally hunted out our favorite cut and then made an S1 of the original, and I mean of the winning cut, and then that was crossed on to the Arcata Rec. So yeah, it's a great strain overall for as I said, for cultivators. We really want to like kind of bring it back to the world, and the one thing I can promise everyone is that they're going to get the real deal. I've seen too many versions of Trainwreck now in the last 10 years or 20, even 15 years, where people are like, yeah, I've got the Trainwreck, and they pull it out, and I'm like, no, that's a cross. That's a Trainwreck cross. I trust me, like I know the strain, and um, almost every time I see a version of Trainwreck, that's pretty much what my answer is. And now ours, uh, there's no argument, and it is a spitting image of what it should be. And so one thing I encourage people, if you're looking at our seeds and trying to decide which one to buy, I know it can be a hard decision, and we get a lot of questions about that, TDub versus Arcata. don't forget that they're half sisters, so they're pretty much very similar already, and they both come from the same lineage. And the TDub comes from the Arcata Rec originally. Um, but we have a variety pack we're selling that will have both of them available. So if you want to try that, along with our newest rec hybrid is the Hot Mess, which is the Trainwreck crossed onto the glue sniffer, and that was the Trainwreck was the reversed, where we got the pollen from it, and then that was we pollinated the glue sniffer with that to make the Hot Mess. And so we are super happy with that strain. We've grown it a few times. It's we're going to be releasing it actually here very soon, as Carlos mentioned, on the 21st. And it totally exactly kind of fit all the boxes that we wanted it to and more. The yield is fabulous on the Hot Mess. It's huge chunky yielder, and it's to be expected. Our glue sniffer is a big yielding plant. We're testing it outdoors to really pinpoint like a finish date on it. So I don't want to give anybody a finish date now, but I can assume it's going to be in the early October range, and probably a massive yielding outdoor plant, and more than likely a mold resistant plant as well, since both the parents have the tendency due to the structure of them. So really happy with that strain as well. So I know I veered off topic a little bit on the original question of the TDub and its history, but I think I want to shoot this back to you, Carlos, and see if you have anything else you want to throw in there, input, or anything you thought of since I've been talking.
Thanks again for joining us, guys. As I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, the Durban portion of this conversation will be released next Sunday. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Sign up for our newsletter on our website to stay on top of all things 2020. And stay tuned, guys, because we have a lot of really cool stuff coming before the end of the year. Thank you for joining.